This video discusses endometriosis, chronic and severe pain, mental health struggles, suicidal thoughts and suicide, sexual intercourse, pregnancy and childbirth complications, and personal experiences with illness. Some of the subjects discussed may be distressing or difficult to hear. Viewer discretion is advised. What is it like living with endometriosis? Endometriosis is a chronic disease affecting an estimated 190 million women of reproductive age worldwide. It occurs when tissue resembling the lining of the uterus grows outside the uterus. It can cause inflammation, lesions, and scarring. And for some people, the pain is not simply uncomfortable. It can be severe. Endometriosis can cause severe menstrual pain, chronic pelvic pain, heavy menstrual bleeding, bloating and nausea, fatigue, pain during sexual intercourse, pain with bowel movements or urination, infertility, and profound effects on quality of life. But there is another part of the story that deserves to be discussed: the psychological burden of living with chronic pain. Research has found higher rates of mental health problems among people with endometriosis. Recent research has also found an increased risk of self-harm, overdose and suicide compared with people without endometriosis. One 2025 study found that approximately 2 in 10 women with endometriosis reported suicidal thoughts. These statistics do not mean that endometriosis automatically causes suicide. Suicide is complex. But they tell us something important. Severe chronic illness can affect far more than the part of the body where the disease begins. There are women whose stories show just how devastating this illness can become. Olympic cyclist Olivia Podmore experienced significant physical and psychological difficulties following endometriosis surgery. During evidence presented at her inquest, she was reported to have expressed thoughts that she might be better off dead. She died in 2021. Other documented cases tell similar stories of women struggling with severe endometriosis pain alongside serious mental health difficulties. And there are survivors whose stories are equally important. Kim, whose family shared her story with Queensland Endometriosis Support, experienced such severe endometriosis pain that she attempted suicide several times. Her story reminds us that the consequences of endometriosis can reach far beyond the reproductive system. These are not merely statistics. Behind every statistic is a human being. A daughter. A sister. A friend. A woman trying to live inside a body that may hurt her every single day. And now I want to talk about what that illness means to me. This is my experience of living with endometriosis. It can mean dreading the arrival of your menstrual period. Knowing that another cycle of pain is coming. Knowing that your body may once again become difficult to live in. And for some people, endometriosis can also mean pain associated with sexual intercourse. For me, that has profoundly affected the way I think about sex. I have spent nearly 20 years without sexual intercourse, firstly because I am a Christian and refuse to commit fornication, and secondly because the pain associated with endometriosis is so severe that sex is something that I never want to do. I have made a decision about my life. I do not want sexual intercourse. I will do everything within my personal boundaries to avoid it. There is another reason why pregnancy and childbirth are something I vehemently avoid when I think about endometriosis. Research has found that endometriosis is associated with an increased risk of complications during pregnancy and childbirth. These complications can include miscarriage, preterm birth, preeclampsia, placenta previa, placental abruption, hemorrhage and cesarean delivery. Some studies have also found an increased risk of serious maternal complications during delivery, including thromboembolism and sepsis. This does not mean that every woman with endometriosis will experience these complications. It does not mean that every pregnancy involving endometriosis will be dangerous. But it does mean that endometriosis is not a condition that should simply be dismissed as painful periods. It can affect the reproductive system, pregnancy, childbirth, and a woman's overall health. For me, these realities are part of why I have no desire to become pregnant. I have chosen a life without sexual intercourse and without pregnancy. That is my personal decision. And I want to make something clear. I am not saying that every woman with endometriosis should make the same decision. I am explaining what endometriosis has meant for me. This is my experience. This is what living with endometriosis has meant to me. Number Rachel Carpini. There are many women who have spoken publicly about what it is like to live with endometriosis. One of them was Australian actress Rachel Carpini. Rachel Carpini was best known for playing Jodie Fountain in McLeod's Daughters. But behind her acting career, she had spent years living with chronic pain. Carpini publicly revealed that she had been diagnosed with endometriosis and adenomyosis. She said that her chronic pain had existed since she was approximately 13 years old. For roughly 2 decades, she had learned to keep going despite the pain. She described the pain as being around 8 or 9 out of 10. She tried heat pads, ice baths, acupuncture, paracetamol and Panadol. But, in her words, these measures did not work. Eventually, she received specialist care that dramatically reduced her pain. She described going from pain around 8-9 out of 10 to approximately 2-3 out of 10. For her, that improvement was significant enough to describe herself as essentially pain-free. But perhaps one of the most important parts of her story was what she said about how her pain had been treated by other people. Carpini said that she had been experiencing chronic pain for years, but had been told that it was simply what women experience. She described being made to feel embarrassed about speaking about her pain. And she described her voice becoming quieter when she tried to discuss it. Her story is important because chronic pain is not always visible. A person can smile. A person can work. A person can appear healthy. And that does not mean that person is not suffering. Rachel Carpini continued working as an actress, including appearing in Home and Away in 2024. Then, in December 2025, her family announced that she had died at the age of 45. Her parents said that she had died unexpectedly but peacefully after a long battle with chronic illness. Her family did not publicly identify the specific illness that caused her death. They requested privacy and said they would make no further statement. Therefore, we cannot truthfully say that Rachel Carpini died from endometriosis or adenomyosis. What we can say is that she had publicly documented diagnoses of both conditions, and she had spoken openly about living with severe chronic pain. Her own testimony gives us a glimpse into what that pain was like. And her story leaves us with an important question. How many women are suffering in silence because they have been taught that severe pain is simply something they are expected to endure? There is another part of the endometriosis story that is difficult to talk about. Self-harm. Suicidal thoughts. Suicide attempts. And, in some cases, death. When people hear the word endometriosis, they may think about painful periods. But for some people, the pain becomes a constant part of everyday life. And when severe pain continues for months or years, it can affect a person's mental health as well as their physical health. Recent research has begun to quantify just how serious this problem can be. A 2025 population-based study in Ontario examined more than 56,000 people diagnosed with endometriosis and compared them with more than 112,000 matched controls. The researchers found that people with endometriosis had a 42% higher adjusted risk of a combined outcome involving intentional self-harm, overdose, and suicide. The study also found a 37% higher adjusted risk of intentional self-harm specifically. The suicide-specific association was not statistically significant, and only 42 suicide events occurred during the study period. This matters. We should never turn an association into a claim of causation. But the increased risk of intentional self-harm is still something that deserves to be taken seriously. Another 2025 study looked specifically at suicidal thoughts among women with endometriosis. Approximately 2 in 10 women with endometriosis in the study reported suicidal ideation. The women who experienced suicidal thoughts also reported greater pain and poorer health. The researchers found that suicidal ideation was associated with several factors, including pain, surgical history, self-blame, and difficulties with emotional coping. This tells us something important. The mental suffering associated with endometriosis cannot simply be separated from the physical suffering. For some women, the pain becomes part of a much larger psychological struggle. Self-harm is not the same thing as suicide. A person can deliberately injure themselves without intending to die. This is known as non-suicidal self-injury. It can occur in the context of overwhelming emotional distress. Suicidal self-harm, on the other hand, involves an intention to die. And some people can experience both kinds of behavior at different times. This distinction is important because medical research often groups different forms of self-harm together when studying large populations. It is also important because a person who is harming themselves deserves help regardless of whether they intend to die. One documented personal account comes from fashion blogger Jane Aldridge. Aldridge has spoken publicly about her experience with severe endometriosis. Her symptoms included severe pelvic pain, nausea, and pain that affected her ability to function normally. She described days when she was bedridden and struggled even to take a shower. She also described repeatedly seeking medical help and being dismissed or told that there was nothing seriously wrong. Eventually, the psychological consequences became overwhelming. Aldridge said that she had become suicidal while dealing with the pain. Her story is especially important because she survived. She was able to speak publicly about what happened and about the process of rebuilding her life while continuing to live with a chronic disease. She also described having to plan her life around the possibility that pain could take over an entire day. That is one of the realities of chronic pain that can be difficult for healthy people to understand. You don't simply experience pain. You begin organizing your life around the possibility of pain. Another case is that of New Zealand Olympic cyclist Olivia Podmore. Podmore had endometriosis and underwent surgery for the condition. Evidence presented during the inquest into her death described significant physical and psychological difficulties following her surgery. She was reported to have expressed thoughts that she might be better off dead. Podmore died in 2021. Her story must be discussed carefully. Her death cannot simply be reduced to endometriosis caused her suicide. Suicide is complex. But her medical difficulties, psychological distress, and endometriosis were documented parts of the circumstances surrounding her life. Her story shows why we need to take severe pain and psychological distress seriously rather than assuming that someone who looks successful must be coping well. There is another story that demonstrates the seriousness of endometriosis even though it does not belong in a list of suicide deaths. Kim's parents, Alan and Jill, shared their daughter's story through Queensland Endometriosis Support. Kim experienced severe endometriosis and chronic pain. Her suffering became so overwhelming that she attempted suicide several times. Her story demonstrates something that statistics cannot. A person can become so exhausted by years of pain that psychological suffering becomes almost impossible to separate from physical suffering. Kim eventually underwent major surgery for endometriosis involving her bowel. She later died from complications following surgery. Her death was not a suicide. That distinction matters. But her repeated suicide attempts during her struggle with severe endometriosis demonstrate how serious the psychological consequences of chronic pain can become. When we talk about self-harm and suicide statistics, it can become easy to forget that every number represents an individual human being. Someone who had plans for her future. Someone who had people who loved her. Someone who may have spent years trying to explain that something was terribly wrong. Someone who may have been told that her pain was normal. Someone who may have been expected to continue working, studying, caring for others and living normally while her body was causing enormous suffering. Endometriosis does not automatically cause suicidal thoughts. And most women with endometriosis will never attempt suicide. But the existence of an increased risk of intentional self-harm means that we cannot ignore the psychological consequences of this